I first met Morgan, I think, a little over a year ago. It was July 1st of last year. I didn't realize it at the time that it was her birthday. I've been praying for Morgan for some time by this point, of course. This is my first chance to meet her face to face. Susan Shiu and I met in the church here. We were just a few pews back on this side, on the side of the lectern. And what followed was, for me, one of the most extraordinary conversations of my whole life. Morgan spoke to me candidly about her cancer. She just laid it all out. The hopeful, the bad, and the ugly. She had a kind of candor about what was going on. Every time I would visit her, she would give me the news in her own voice, and it was always very straightforward. And during this conversation, after we discussed what was happening to her, what had been happening to her for some time by this point, Morgan said something which she repeated many times after, and which Alex just referred to. She said that she believed this was God's plan, that it was happening to her for a reason. Morgan had such profound conviction in this statement that it startled me. It even worried me for her. I was afraid she would be sorely disappointed. I have to say, I don't believe everything happens for a reason, at least not if that reason is God. I think some things happen for a reason, but some things happen for reasons other than God. I believe there's a kind of chaos or nothingness or evil which is at work in the world, which threatens always to undo the world, to suck the stitches out of its seams, and that this is part of what the biblical language of demons, the devil, and sin are about. Some things in creation happen because God makes them to, but some things happen in spite of God and to spite God. That's what I think that biblical language is getting at. And this means that when bad things happen to people, like Morgan's cancer, I don't think it's immediately obvious whether they're happening because God willed them to. But neither do I think it's immediately obvious that God didn't, just because they seem horrible to us. I think that any answers we find to this question in this life have to be sweated out in prayer, and that's what I encourage Morgan to do. I encourage Morgan to put her conviction that this cancer was God's plan for her to the test. And I gave her some advice, which I gave her several times, from St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. Ignatius said that when God is present in something, it brings you life and light and strength. And he calls this life, light, and strength consolation. And when God is not in something, when it is this chaos, this nothingness that is at work instead, it brings you what Ignatius calls desolation. It's not depression exactly, it's not sadness, it's the feeling like something is sucking the life out of you. And I encouraged Morgan to think about whether the idea that this was God's plan for her was giving her life or sucking her life away, and that would be a way perhaps to discern what God was really up to. Morgan did what I encouraged her to, and she sweated this one out in her soul with the Lord. I remember, Susan, that a few days before I came to visit you and Morgan in the hospital the first time, when she was receiving her first chemo treatment, that you sent me a text message. And in the text message, you said that Morgan had said her faith had been so strong, but that she felt that her heart didn't have the conviction it once had. And at the hospital, Morgan said that she couldn't feel God anymore as she could before, and that the peace which she'd had, even just a month earlier, now eluded her. She didn't know where it was. And that was when I spoke to you both about how sometimes, as you shared with the family at the cemetery, that God sometimes comes so close to us in our suffering that it's as though all we can do is look straight ahead, and we can't see that God is right beside us or even carrying us. And I said this to you and to Morgan, and the thought consoled her. She said something like, "I like that. That sounds right. And in the end, rather than shake her sense that her sickness was in God's plan, this experience of God's absence, in its own way, I think, a participation in the experience which Jesus had of his Father's absence on the cross, it only increased her confidence that this was part of God's plan. It only increased the consolation she got from that belief. Especially as she shed some of the flimsier accoutrement, which sometimes attends talk about everything happening for a reason. I love the conversation I had with Morgan this past February in the hospital, again with you, Susan, where she talked about toxic positivity. It's a good word for all of us. Toxic positivity. The idea that you can't acknowledge when you're sad, you're frustrated, or disappointed. She said, I'm done with toxic positivity. Morgan was a real person. A real person. She was scared, she was frustrated, she was sad, she was tired. And in the midst of all of that, stitched in between and within all of that, was a faith which kept her life from coming apart even when her body was coming apart. And it was totally extraordinary. I told her during that visit in February, I told you, Susan, that God's power would be made perfect in her weakness, as St. Paul said, and it was. It was. During that visit, Morgan called herself a spiritual being having a human experience. And you were right, Alex. Her hope was not in the things of this world. That human experience that she, a radiant spiritual being like none I've ever met, full of life, light, and joy, who brings people together, who convened joy in her very being, her human experience brought her both loss and joy. And in February, when we were at Sloan together, she said that she was recording in those days in a gratitude journal, manifesting her desires for her well-being and for the well-being of her family and of her friends. She never, ever forgot other people. And she never forgot to be thankful. I remember that when we were doing Last Rites together on Saturday, Morgan took a moment to pray. And Morgan said some things to God which I was unbelievably privileged to hear, including something to the effect of, we just appreciate you so much and appreciate your many gifts. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, this young woman to whom this thing has happened is saying this to the Lord of the universe. She felt that way. She felt that way often. She felt that way deeply in her soul. The losses which her human experience brought her were carried with unbelievable dignity and grace. She was helped by God in this, but she was helped also by you, Susan. And by you, Lauren. And by you, Tyler, Sydney, and Alex. And by her friends. And by the prayers of hundreds of people in this town and elsewhere. Morgan was an incredible example of spiritual hospitality. She wanted the prayers and the help of anyone and everyone, of any faith and none, in a great lesson to all of us. And with this help, Morgan fought the good fight. She did. And she finished the race which was set before her, which was that sure and certain hope to which Alex referred. To hold fast to the hope that she had in God. Hope which weathered ambulance rides and surgeries and anxious nights, and finally the news last Friday that she was going to die. You all shared with me, which Alex referred to, that when the oncologist told Morgan there was nothing more that they could do, Morgan said something to the effect of, I just need to process. And then after a while, she said she understood. That is shocking. Absolutely shocking. Shocking that she understood, full stop. Just period. Shocking that she understood in so short a time as that. Miraculous. It was a work of God's grace, as I said to some of you when we met in Father Peter's office earlier this week. It was a testament to the extraordinary strength and beauty of her soul. And I know that Morgan said even at the end and repeatedly that this was God's plan for her and this was her journey. And as I told you, Susan and Lauren, outside the hospital room on Saturday when we performed last rites, I believe Morgan. Morgan was the authority on her own life and the authority on her relationship with God. And even though I have no idea what God is up to in the long run of things, I've got no clue why in the world this would be God's plan. I have a little idea of what God was partly up to in Morgan's last days. So 3 years after her diagnosis, Morgan was told she was going to die. And in the 3 days following the news, I'm going to share some things with everybody which the family has shared with me. In those 3 days following the news, Morgan went back and forth in her consciousness between this life and the life of the world to come, which we called heaven. She described this experience by saying it was like looking at myself in a mirror. This is something which happens to some people. It is a grace which is given to some people, though not to all. What's remarkable is how vividly she narrated it for all of you as it was happening. When I arrived on Saturday to administer last rites at Sloan, the family told me that the evening before they'd sensed a presence in the room, and Morgan had said it was Pops, your father, Susan. And that Morgan had been talking to other people who had died, people whom she later called her spiritual family. She said that her spiritual family was with her as well as her physical family. And I understand that as you cared so beautifully for her, Tyler and Sydney, I have to say, one of the most amazing things I've ever seen in my life was the two of you helping Morgan to drink. Each sip a race that she had to complete. She did that because of the two of you. You made that possible for her. But as you all cared for her, and you did, she cared for you. As you consoled her, she gave you consolation, not unlike what's happening in our gospel lesson this morning, where Jesus is consoling his disciples, whom he's just told he's going to die. Jesus is the one who's going to die, but he's there telling his disciples, don't let your hearts be troubled, believe in God, believe also in me. Morgan all but said those exact words. On Monday, I understand that you all prayed the Lord's Prayer as a family, and Morgan said amen at the end of it. And then she fell asleep. And 3 hours later, she died. 3 days after she was told there was nothing more her doctors could do. 3 years after she received her diagnosis. 3 hours, 3 days, and 3 years. God wrote poetry in what was otherwise just gruesome. I don't know why. I don't. I believe, Morgan, that God did it, but I don't know why. What I do know is that the Lord himself received the sentence of death, and 3 days later, he rose from the dead. And I believe that on Morgan's third day, having made her death as well as her life look more like his, the Lord took Morgan to himself to dwell with him in his Father's house forever. I just want to say, just because Morgan understood and quickly doesn't mean that we have to right now. Doesn't mean that we each need to have that same understanding right this moment and completely. This understanding may come and it may go from you, and that is okay. Morgan's own journey had its ups and its downs, right? That's why I told you all about her moment of experiencing God's absence. This faith and this hope, they were extraordinary, but they were a real hope in a real world, in a real life. And your race is different from hers. She's won her race. She completed it. She kept the faith. Yours is still ongoing. You're still going to live just as Morgan told you you would. And I'll say to all of you what I shared with just Susan, Lauren, and Alex on Tuesday morning, what Morgan experienced, what you've all experienced, is traumatic. It was traumatic psychologically, and it was a cross spiritually. And I just want to say, you can just take it all, and you can just put it in your heart. And you can take all that's happened and all you've heard and seen, just keep these things and ponder them in your heart. Like Mary took the prophecies told her about Jesus after his birth. She just says, the scriptures say that she took these things and pondered them in her heart, and they unfurled for her over the course of Jesus' life. And I think that the goings on of these last 3 years, the last 3 days, and those last 3 hours are going to just unfurl for you as you keep living in the company of Morgan and all the saints. But as you do so, as you let these mysteries unfurl for you, as you keep alive the joy which she's given you and your family, as you make sense of what her death means for you, what her death means for the world, you can hold fast to the consolation which Morgan shared with you when she was dying. She is okay. And somehow all of this is going to be okay. In the words of the great medieval English mystic Julian of Norwich, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. I understand that at the end, in these 3 days, Morgan saw a window filled with light, and that she spoke of there being a party on the other side, a party that she had to get to, and that she was very concerned she was wearing the right clothes for. And I want to share these words from this medieval mystic Julian, from a vision that she received when she was just barely older than Morgan was. She was 30 years old. She was horrifically sick, like Morgan. She was near death. She did not actually die in this year when she was 30. She lived to record what had happened. This was in the year 1373. It's in the 14th century. It's separated from Morgan by 650 years. But her words about what she saw are remarkably similar to Morgan's, and they fill out what was behind that window. So here's Julia. Our good Lord said to me, I thank you for your suffering, especially the suffering of your youth. And at that my understanding was lifted up into heaven, where I saw our Lord as a Lord in his own house, who has invited all his beloved friends and servants to a solemn feast. Then I saw the Lord took no seat in his own house, but reigned royally over everyone, serving everyone. And he filled his house with joy and delight, himself gladdening and comforting his beloved friends familiarly and courteously, with a marvelous melody of endless love in his own fair blessed face, and the glorious face of the Godhead which fills heaven full of joy and bliss. May we too come to the end of our races, those which are set before us, to that marvelous party, where I believe Morgan now joins the Lord in filling the house of his Father with joy. Joy without end.